Today's video is sponsored by Incogni. More on them in a minute. Are we living in World War III now? Or are we just counting down toward it? Or maybe we can avoid it altogether. Look, world wars are, fortunately, infrequent enough that trying to code them as a social scientist is a fool's errand. It will be up to the general public to decide in the future, if the general public still exists in the future, what a world war is. Maybe they will point to the Iran war as the start of it. Maybe they will move it back to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, since that was the first front. Maybe they will get spicy and date it all the way back to the Russian annexation of Crimea. And it is true. I do not keep showing this plot of the current battle lines because it is an interesting visual, even though it is. I do it because it gets at something. Take Russia. Russia has fought in Ukraine receiving Shahed drone technology from Iran, direct soldiers on loan from North Korea, and some more passive trade help from China. Iran took some of the proceeds from weapon sales to Russia and invested them in its proxies that flank Israel, helping trigger the October 7th attack. Then the United States ramped up military aid to Israel to support the Gaza war. Fast forward a few years, and then you add a war in Iran. Russia returned the favor with drone assistance back to Tehran. And at the risk of feeling like we are in a pinball machine, the United States had a whole bunch of Arab allies support the fight, and then Ukraine began helping those countries with their drone defenses. So, yeah, it is a world at war. But the one thing that would undoubtedly turn this into a widely recognized world war is clear on the other side of the globe: a PRC invasion of Taiwan. That has always been the main event anyway, and it would put the world's two greatest militaries in direct combat with one another. With everyone's bandwidth razor thin, it is easy to overlook the concern. But the PRC brushing up against Taiwan's territorial waters has become a fact of life for those living on the island. It is also why national security types are so worried about the situation. And thus the countdown to what would assuredly be called World War III is a question of when Beijing decides to cross the strait. In turn, we are moving beyond just the puzzle of why the PRC might do this. We now have to advance to exploring a more specific timeline given what is happening in the world. So, for the rest of this video, we will consider 4 possibilities. One is the optimistic take. Never. Thank the costs of war for that. Then we will turn to the most likely scenario for war prior to the whole Iran thing: an invasion in the next few years, triggered by the PRC's demographic decline. Third, we will get spicy and analyze how the Iran war could accelerate those plans, since, really, our entire discussion is taking place in the shadow of Iran. And finally, we will look deep into the future and see how an entirely different mechanism could cause the same end problem. Look, sometimes you just have to sit back and laugh at how little control we have over this situation. But for me, the solution to the problem is to control what I can. And one thing that you can control is the amount of private information about you that is just sitting there out on the internet. That is where the sponsor of today's video, Incogni, comes in. They will be your ally in a tangled web of data brokers to help shrink your digital footprint, thereby reducing the chances that someone might track you down or use your personal information to take out loans in your name. And whereas your enemies may have an unlimited partnership against you, Incogni has an unlimited plan. It allows you to issue custom removal requests that they will then handle. So take back your personal data, head to incogni.com/WilliamSpaniel, and use the coupon code WilliamSpaniel, all one word, to get 60% off an annual plan. And thanks again to Incogni for sponsoring today's video. Okay. Let's be optimists for a second and discuss why we could avoid a World War III situation altogether. War is costly, and when we are thinking about this in terms of a US-China confrontation, we are potentially looking at a scale unseen since the 1940s. The substantive issue in dispute is Taiwan's level of sovereignty. In its ideal world, Taiwan would like to express itself freely. In the PRC's ideal world, Taiwan would simply be an offshore province of the mainland. We will use the length of the island as a meter of Taiwanese independence. The higher the line, the happier Taipei is. If Beijing ever decides to invade, there is some chance that the plan will work, and the PRC will achieve its goal. And there is some chance that the PLAN will fail and Taiwan will do what it pleases, knowing that Beijing is no longer able to do anything about it. Average out those possibilities, plus various forms of stalemates that could arise, and you get an average outcome that hypothetically looks like this. I am putting it dead center because it is visually easier for me to do the rest. But remember that there will be a high human cost to pay here, plus an enormous financial cost, as the end of semiconductor production kills worldwide supply chains, plus a political problem for Beijing for all of the parents whose only child perished during the war. You do not even need to consider the nuclear angle for this whole thing to be a conflagration. If we scale those sacrifices according to Beijing's value for controlling Taiwan, then the space between the white and red lines represents how the capital internalizes the costs of war. That makes the literal red line a figurative red line in negotiations. If Taiwan were to ever set an independence policy higher than that, the PRC would find war more attractive than letting that become the new normal. Meanwhile, the same thing goes the other way for Taiwan. Taipei would not let Beijing create a situation where its de facto independence drops below that line. Now, the great thing about these costs is that it encourages the parties to negotiate a solution short of war. And indeed, that is what happens in practice, or at least has happened so far. Taiwan acts as de facto independent, but is careful to not go too far so as to trigger a war from Beijing. And if this is all we had to worry about, or if the costs of war were absolutely extreme, we could breathe a sigh of relief. There is no war in, say, Taipei. Unfortunately, there is more that we have to worry about. Even before anything happened in Iran, the national security community has been very concerned about what might happen a few years from now. To give you the short version of the story, and not the 90-minute one that we have already done once, the PRC's one-child policy was a little too effective, and now the mainland is facing a demographics crisis. The window where an invasion might still be feasible is fading away, so the war must either be soon or never, according to this theory. That would break the happy conclusion from before, by now assuming that power changes over time. Such shifts can override the cost calculations if the mainland's power will decline so much that the PRC can get more today by fighting, even at its costs, compared to the best it could possibly obtain in the future. Beijing is well aware of this concern. Many years ago, she set 2027 as the deadline for the PLA to be ready for an invasion. This often gets conflated as a codified plan for an actual invasion, which it is not. And the most recent intelligence reports suggest that an invasion will need to be pushed back by a couple of years. The basic problem is that you need landing ships to, actually land on Taiwan. As of November 2025, the PLA only had capacity to carry about 20,000 troops. Estimates for the number of forces required for an invasion to be successful run between 300,000 and 1 million. Beijing is trying to rectify this problem. Indeed, the PRC now accounts for about 53% of worldwide shipbuilding capacity. Thus, the plan for the PLAN is to watch the United States exhaust itself in Iran, build sufficient ships, and then invade before its demographics completely tank. Of course, that would be good news as compared to option 3, an invasion this year. Fortunately, this ranks as the least likely possibility, but let's still run through what would need to be true for it to happen. Basically, it would require a massive intelligence failure from the United States. What I just discussed about landing ships would have to be wrong. More are built, and Beijing is willing to take over civilian vessels to finish the job. Add to the list further intelligence mistakes about the mainland's rocket force suffering from corruption problems. And speaking of corruption, also add in the corruption charges / purges in disguise that she initiated on top military leaders. Maybe those are no big deal after all, despite the person tasked to reform the corrupt rocket forces himself being removed for corruption. Funny thing, that is also exactly what happened to the guy that the Kremlin tasked to crack down on corruption in the Russian armed forces following the Georgian War. Anyway, why the PRC might want to rush the job is because of the Iran war. US weapon stockpiles were low before the aerial campaign began, and now they are even lower. Congress will earmark funds to build above and beyond the pre-war stockpiles, but that takes time. Beijing may prefer a half-baked invasion if it will face a quarter-baked defense. If this is indeed Beijing's thinking, we can further narrow down the timeline. Weather along the Taiwan Strait tends to be horrible, with fog, monsoons, and choppy waters potentially disrupting any landing force. The only months of relative calm are April, May, October, and November. The April and May window does not give Beijing enough time to put the operation together. That leaves October and November as the months to watch for this year. One thing to note here. It is widely believed that part of the US desire to initiate the Iran war was to disable Tehran's ability to resist later. After all, a two-front war would be a major problem if the PRC ever crossed the strait. The fact that the United States chose to do it is a signal that the private information floating around Washington is that the PRC is definitely not close to being ready. Thus, this was the right time for the United States to attack Iran, if you thought that Iran was indeed a liability. That intelligence could be wrong, and US attrition could cause it to become wrong, but at least that was apparently not the US assessment as of a few months ago. Finally, there is the possibility that all this happens next decade. Maybe it will avoid the World War III designation as a result, or maybe the Kremlin will take the opportunity to invade Europe. After all, plenty of time will have passed by the end of the Russia-Ukraine war. The Kremlin will have overseen a reinvestment in the Russian armed forces, and they would bet that their experience in Ukraine will allow them to dominate whichever European armies try to stand in their way. Back in the Pacific, this time the problem is more nuanced. The PRC lets the demographic swing happen without invading. However, in the meantime, semiconductor production drifts across the Pacific. This is, in fact, already underway, with TSMC setting up an Arizona satellite operation. In this hypothesized future, the United States is no longer dependent on Taiwan's survival for high-end chips. With economic interdependence no longer as relevant, China executes a fait accompli, simply moving onto the island one day with little explanation, a futuristic version of the annexation of Crimea, to draw a parallel. One slight problem. The future US president genuinely wants to protect Taiwan, aside from any economic concerns about semiconductors. Beijing miscalculated Washington's resolve to fight, and so you end up in a war anyway. This pathway would closely fit the PRC's long-running MO. Do not do anything to rock the boat, and then eventually take advantage of the situation when the time is right. And Chinese intelligence may very well be right, where a disinterested president passes on pushing back, and the parties avoid World War III. Taiwan falls off the map, but apparently that is the island's problem, not the United States's. Or we end up in a conflagration, because Chinese intelligence got it wrong. But miscalculations like that never happen, right? So, what are our takeaway lines for today? The cost of war ought to give us a default expectation that the PRC and Taiwan can avoid a costly war against each other. Unfortunately, shifting power dynamics have led many observers to worry that an invasion may be inevitable in a few years. It is possible that the Iran war might accelerate those plans. Or Beijing will bide its time, try the invasion a decade from now, and hope that the United States no longer cares enough about Taiwan to come to the island's aid. Thanks to the folks at Ohio University who had to endure a rough draft of this video. They have a beautiful campus. And also thanks again to Incogni for sponsoring today's video. Head over to incogni.com/William Spaniel to get a great deal to protect yourself. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe. And I will see you next time. Take care.